Anything that you need to tell us, please put on your evaluation forms or notes from your table. But given that caveat, what was a big takeaway from your group? Something big that you noticed or that you found or that was great, bad, something else? One thing.
Feel free to come on in. It's a little easier.
All right, Lawrence.
Site areas, limit zones.
Ah.
You gave us a site description, so maybe there's something that you didn't want to have, and you lot size.
So there was a minimum lot size in MX, and your site was smaller than that minimum, and we had to scrap that minimum to do anything.
That's in the IDO.
That's in the IDO.
Why do we have minimums?
Why do we have minimums?
Usually, this is one of those things that's carried over from the old C2 code, which until today, nobody's questioned. A lot of older zoning codes have minimum lot sizes for their commercial development projects. But I'm a big fan of incrementals, and I do agree with you that in many cases you don't need them. In some cases you do, in many cases you don't. I think it's been fine.
Well, I would suggest that the health and safety thing that zoning is supposed to do for us is already being covered by the International Building Code and the way the buildings are built, how far they need to be apart, all that kind of stuff. So even setbacks and the like, setbacks is one thing. Minimum lot area, I can see with the old code, you need it because you've got all that off-street parking based on the number of toilets you have. So you need a lot of room for that, so you should have a minimum.
But after you add in all those requirements, you're going to end up with whatever you end up with.
Yeah.
And maybe there's a minimum lot size in which it pencils out, but why restrict it? You can have
Come in here.
Yeah, the other thing was the parking wasn't as aggressive for farm-based code that you would think. The Knoxville sector plan actually had incentives for smaller square footage. It was like no parking spaces for under 3,000 square feet commercial. So once you hit the new code, our new under the new code, you actually needed 13 spaces as opposed to the Knoxville code, you needed 8 spaces.
And I'll just say that Knoxville does not like their existing parking regs, so that was part of the shift that was
But at
intended.
least they got out of the toilet county.
Right. What was something else that you learned in your group? Good, bad, surprising?
We couldn't find the requirements for accessible parking.
For handicap parking?
Yeah, in the new. There was also, I think, in my opinion, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like the old one had a straightforward parking count. It didn't account for visitors in any obvious, in any way we could discern, or it was embedded in there, and then the new one, the parking requirement was lower, and also applied just by units, so we were experimenting with larger units and more units, could actually meet the density allowed, and but then there were added visitor spaces.
Do the rounding conventions change the idea?
I didn't hear the question.
The rounding conventions, any partial number becomes what the round
Remember,
size.
I try to use third grade math, which is you round up and you round down. So if you want to round them all down, that's fine with me, but I make it simple. Just
It says round down.
fine. Just round down.
Okay.
Lawrence, and then Kendra?
Just between Don and the thing we did about reading from the whole set of eyes. We found one rule that had one word missing, we completely reversed it. And one little number that really changed the universe. To 600 feet. So it's like somebody who hasn't looked at it 1,900 times already.
Yeah, I think if we had a parking piece and a cost for parking, then you would see, what's the consequence of there being more parking, more cost? And I still be able to make this work.
That's great.
So right now, it's just assuming that parking is right.
Carol?
So if time was an issue, I was wondering about being dictatorial and not having people choose which development type to do, but just say you do this, yes. Because we took a little time, we collaborated a bit, trying to decide which one.
I think that would help time, but I think if you're a developer for a day, there really should be a period of what the hell am I doing? Because that is where every developer starts.
And I think it's also good to note that there might be flexibility. So if we say you have to do residential because your original space is just residential, but then all of a sudden you get mixed use, but you've been told you have to do a residential, you can't kind of play with the opportunities that arise.
Maybe some tips on how to narrow in. So they can get back and forth, right?
If we had, in the introduction, if we ran through, okay, here's a simple site, we picked, the simplest building, we figured out the rents and the costs, and the building makes money, and that's how you know. And here's how we found the market. If we ran kind of all the way from the front to the end, it seems a little impossible. Although there's a lot to be said for that sense of frustration and anxiety about, is this ever going to work? That's actually good experience.
Like having the building blocks, parking and buildings, developing study them left, scale it, and that might take some time.
We've done it with little baseboard buildings and little overlays of different parking arrangements, so you don't have to go out and spend
And maybe
paper dollars.
what might take a long time is calculating this where the area for parking is not having a road of front. Right? Maybe if we just provided that. I use 300 square feet.
Yeah, then you give them a couple of parking lots.
Yeah.
And they can decide not to go to those places.
Had an introduction or overview of the IDO at the beginning because we were trying to discover the IDO and use it at the same time. Did you say that?
Yes, and it's confusing because it's still not the old standards, but it makes that is the IDO standard.
On parking.
Yeah.
On parking.
I think just to explain the intent, you try and make it better as opposed to you've just been tortured with the existing zoning and now there's a new torture. We want to be able to say, we're trying to make this better and easier.
It was a much simpler, more elegant form for.
That's the whole
Elegant
bar.
torture, that was our bar, Lawrence.
Can I ask you a couple of questions as an observer here? One is, and just a question, I love the way you set it up, where you have to deal with real buildings that are real performance. My question is this: how much time did the different tables use on the economics as opposed to playing around with whether they could make the physical structure fit on the site? 50? Is that right?
Was it valuable?
Okay.
What was interesting is we put in different numbers and tried different versions of the performance. And so I think that was interesting information, instead of enlightening. It's like, okay, we did all this and it didn't pencil out, and maybe we need to raise our rents. Could we raise our rents?
And my second issue, if I can, is this. I was intrigued how this ran. Usually, when I'm in a testing process, the question is, does it work under the new code? The bridge of whether we hate the old code has been crossed. So you're not spending time educating people that they don't like the old code. You're trying to figure out what you need to change in the new code. So my question is, I'm happy going either way. I'm glad that people didn't come in and say we love the old code better. Nobody said that to my face yet. But,
Although the second
compare old versus new, or refine the approach to try to get better feedback on what's wrong with the new. Because
What's the goal?
what's the goal? That's the question. Are we educating people as to the difference in the old and the new? Or are we trying to refine the new?
So I'll just share that the original idea was just to run the IDO. And it was an idea from one of the ULI members who does some development work that it's hard to know whether the new IDO works unless you've had kind of an apples to apples comparison of what you could do under the existing. So at least from that person's perspective, it was helpful.
Sorry. Not only is it easier to use, but also it's more lucrative. So that was kind of one of the metrics, whether the new zoning was successful, was can I make more money on the new zoning, or can I make more else?
And for the neighborhood roads, what would result be, arguably that the less shape, I don't know what that means. So Brian, what were you thinking in terms of, running both versus just the other way?
You know, I think there are multiple things that come out of doing both. If we just need a technical review, we can convene a bunch of people without all the effort to get a diverse group and neighborhood people. But I think what we're thinking is that people are going to learn a lot more by having to struggle with each other, get to know each other, hear the neighborhood person and the plan reviewer and the parking and whatever, right? And so that's part of it. We have time, if we wanted to do a more thorough sort of staff and volunteer-driven review of the new code, if you wanted that. We can make the room bigger. We can talk about, if we talk about the convention center, maybe we have 15 tables or something, or 20, I don't know. It's another option.
So Tara.
And then I was just gonna say that I think it's helpful to have the full, especially part of it is to show, because for certain stuff we are trying to prove to the community that there's a reason for doing this, and then it will help them get better development, and I think that's one of the things is that you can kind of see that under the old code, people are really struggling to fit everything in, and we didn't even get to talk about design versus in the time that was allotted with the new code, we were able to start thinking about like what would our building facades look like, or how do we put a balcony? And so as an exercise, I think it gives people, and obviously 45 minutes is not what you do in their situation, but if you have a little bit more freedom, then you can see that there's freedom to talk about design and making things look good and feel good for the people that are living there.
Yeah, and the incentives embedded in each are different.
I saw a couple head shakes when we said, was it helpful to do both? So can I hear from a couple people who thought maybe it's better just to do the IDO? Nobody thinks that anymore.
I think it's a tough one to do a lot.
Is there a way that we could just give the tables, we maxed it out with the existing code, what can you do with the IDO? Or we're really trying to get them to see that the existing one is multi-layered and
I think that pulls in and not apples to oranges, or it pulls in apples to oranges. Here's what we did, you do something different with a whole different code. It's
more
kind
like
of-
here's an apple pie, here's some apples.
Yeah.
One of the issues we ran into, we had Nob Hill, was we didn't have time to do anything besides parking. So our entire development was generated based on parking, both ways.
Do you think the IDO should really just
So as an observer, I thought it was actually helpful to have two tables doing the same site because I could see where they had common struggles and where it was just two different groups having two different ideas. So I kind of like having the double table idea, but it does mean more people.
In this exercise, when you're starting from scratch and trying to see what you can do on a blank slate, I like doing both the current and the IDO. For an exercise for just the IDO, I think it'd be interesting, and I've actually been tasked with this at the city, is to look at projects that have already been built under the current code, existing constructed sites, and see if they could be built in the way they were in the new code, or what differences. So if someone built an auto zone, is that auto zone, the way it's designed,
exempt small lots in different zone districts for some of the other jurisdictions altogether. But that doesn't matter. It doesn't. It's such a small part of the block face, it's such a small part of the fabric. It doesn't matter whether they carry their water or not. The neighbor who carries their water does.
Or when is it too big that it's the square footage just has a maximum amount? Like that's
Well,
what.
I think that also open space requirements kind of as a tool are, a lot of people have a different idea about what that hammer is. A lot of people think open space requirement is a proxy for less shitty buildings. And so to actually talk about usable open space, coherent design, intentional open space versus do you have enough parking lot buffer, in a tree that'll never be more than a sound. Okay, check the box. You haven't really, you complied with something, you haven't done anything that adds to the larger picture. In Miami, they recently removed all off-street parking requirements for buildings less than 10,000 square feet. And a lot of Miami is platted in 25 and 50-foot lots that you would have to combine to create off-street parking, and their 50-foot lots that are in between, existing buildings. There's a requirement here with a certain proximity to transit and the like. You're not prevented from consolidating parcels and doing parking, but you're not required to have to do it, so it can become a market decision. So I think that you can do the same thing with, rather than saying this is the requirement, if your parcel is below a certain size, again, it will exempt you, and if you do a courtyard or a plaza or some usable open space, we'll think well of you. You get bonus. But I like there's some stuff you're just gonna have to let go, because the more you try to finesse it, it's like trying to get a hold of wet soap.
I will say on the usable open space, we ran into that on our zoning. It's really hard. It's just like minimum parking permit takes up a lot of space. But under the IDO, it was reduced significantly from the current code. So it's still in the draft of the new code is a lot more flexible than what the current regulations are.
What else? Changes you make, things you keep the same in terms of the exercise.
The group size was maybe kind of large, 21 person talking at once. We didn't do a real good job. I don't know if it's really natural to kind of divide and conquer. I think we were given instructions to kind of like, okay, assign different people different roles, but it was difficult. I think the nature of looking at a blank piece of paper is for people to interact and talk. I don't know. I don't think there wasn't a division of labor that happened in our table very much. I don't know if it's too big of an assignment or if it had fewer people for, I don't know.
So I think we thought about 5 in September, so 5 participants plus 1 resource person at the table, so not as active as you all were necessarily with that. How would that feel to you all? About right?
I think a lot of it will be the room. This is pretty loud. Place that was carpeted, we were not using.
We could throw down some area rugs. We could throw down some rugs that we could not install.
Is that what you
I like that. I was just adding generally for tonight, to be more comfortable because it is complicated.
How much more time?
Yeah, how much?
Because I actually liked that you all felt pressure to keep moving as opposed to let's flounder for 40 minutes and then do something in 10.
Well, and we also felt the sort of benefit that came from the IDO, which is that we got to the point where we had the freedom to talk about interesting things that we didn't have time to talk about in the first round. And I think that if we had more time in the first round, that would be quite a real feeling. But I think we can get really clear that we shouldn't necessarily be expected to finish.
I think if we, in the setup where we run through the exercise, graphically as you see that flow, we say, okay, so you have to get this done in 10 minutes, and this is at the 20-minute mark, and this is the 30 and the like. So then, and typically people will be dragging and moving behind, you're gonna have to like make a call and go forward. You can't work it forever. If you want to get all the way to the end, it's still something.